Okay, welcome to the show. And this is our last episode of season 1 about the Christiana Riot.
It's exciting. And I'm like, I feel disconnected from the story now. I feel like we might need a little recap.
Okay.
Just for me, if not for any potential audience that we may have. It's just been a really long time in like our lives.
Right.
Like we recorded like a long time ago because
like 4 weeks ago or something
a bunch
like
of people got sick and then like a bunch of bad weather happened and we just kept having to push it back.
Yes. So yeah, quick recap. 4 men escaped from a farm in northern Maryland called Retreat Farm. They made their way to southeastern Pennsylvania in Lancaster County and hooked up with a guy named William Parker. Their former slaver, Edward Gorsuch, came to track them down 2 years later at, great financial loss, just purely out of stubborn pride. He was led by a cowardly, liar, I guess, named Marshall Klein. And there's
like a bunch of crooked cops and that guy who likes disguises.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so they descended on the Parker farm in Christiana, Pennsylvania. There was a fight. The people within the Parker house used a horn to call all the neighbors. All the neighbors showed up. Things escalated. Edward Gorsuch ended up dead. His son Dickinson ended up with a bunch of buckshot in him. And his nephew, Dr. Pierce, got clubbed to the point where he had headaches for like the rest of his life. All the men from the house made it to freedom. The 4 men who had escaped from Edward Gorsuch's farm disappeared from the historical record, presumably made it to Canada and lived out their lives up there. Parker and his brother-in-law escaped to Canada and with the help of Frederick Douglass and established lives up there. Eventually his wife Eliza came up and met up with him and they lived up in Canada for a while. We'll follow up today on what happened to them after they made it up into Canada. There was a trial where they decided to try the white neighbors of the Parkers because
they assumed they must have been in charge.
Yes, the justice system in the 1800s assumed that the white people who were there doing nothing, seemingly just watching, must have been in charge of the black people. Then the trial went well for Castor Hanway, and he was found not guilty. And then they just kind of dropped the charges against everyone else to avoid any further humiliation.
Which was like a big failure for the Fugitive Slave Act. Yeah.
And that was kind of the biggest impact of the whole thing, was that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had been passed just that year or the year before. This was like a
bunch of people were mad about it,
and this was the first real legal trial of the Fugitive Slave Act and the Compromise of 1850, and it did not withstand the legal trial, which hastened the country on the road to the Civil War. So today we're just going to kind of see where everybody went afterwards and kind of the impact that this had on the country and that lead up to the Civil War. So let me put this in viewing mode.
Good recap.
Yeah. All right. So for this episode and all the episodes, the main source is the book Bloody Dawn by Thomas P. Slaughter. Some additional sources: A Freedman's Tale, which was written by William Parker in 1866. Friendsjournal.org, an article called "In 1851, a Maryland farmer tried to kidnap free blacks in Pennsylvania. He wasn't expecting the neighborhood to fight back." William Parker, Runaway Slave and Abolitionist, by George Gilbert at Dickinson College. BuxtonMuseum.com/history of Eliza Parker. Eliza Ann Elizabeth Howard Parker from Lincoln. That was the Buxton Museum article. Sorry. And then LincolnConspirators.com, Freedom's Battle of Christiana. And a lot of those had been sources throughout the whole series. I think I tried to do a good job of citing the sources at the top of every episode, but I think I missed a couple. But more or less, it's Bloody Dawn by Thomas Slaughter was the main source, and it's a good book. It's worth reading if you can get a hold of it. I guess we'll start with what happened with the exact aftermath in the immediate aftermath of the trial. So, like I said, there were still charges against the other defendants and federal misdemeanor charges against Castor Hanway. He was found not guilty of treason, but he still had some misdemeanor charges outstanding. Hanway and the others did give testimony that led to Marshall Klein being indicted for perjury 1 month later. And basically what they decided was they would drop the perjury charges against Klein if all the other charges would be dropped against Hanway, and they would just have it as a clean slate. With Hanway innocent and Parker and the others in Canada, there was no one pursued for further convictions. So nobody gets in any trouble for killing Edward Gorsuch.
All right.
Yep. It is notable that the grand jury let the black men go free. They didn't have anyone they could be proven to be directly involved in Gorsuch's death, but black men were are convicted in Lancaster County with less evidence. With less evidence than they had.
Right.
So they probably could have still pursued charges against the black men, but I think at this point it was enough of a embarrassment for everybody that they just kind of wanted it to go away. Hanway had accumulated huge debts from the case, and the judge denied restitution. So he was innocent, but he was financially ruined.
Okay.
And then there was also, we had talked about in previous episodes how, I think it was 40 some black people were held in jail during this whole trial, either because they were defendants that were going to be tried in, presumably tried in future trials, or they were witnesses because they did that weird thing where they were holding witnesses in jail. So they also, had been financially ruined from this because, it wasn't like they got paid leave from their jobs for this time period. So this was months that they had been out of work. There was an African-American Vigilance Committee in Rochester, New York, and another one in Philadelphia that kind of passed the hat and took up a collection and gave money to all the black defendants to kind of help them get back on their feet. And the Salisbury, Pennsylvania Quaker meeting paid for Castor Hanway and the other white defendants.
Okay.
So kind of the local
looking out for them.
Yeah, the local abolitionists kind of pulled their money together and got everybody back on their feet. Thousands of abolitionists showed up in Philadelphia to cheer Hanway and the other white guy, Elijah Lewis, as the white heroes of Christiana.
Okay.
An abolitionist by the name of Joshua Giddings, who had previously cheered Gorsuch's death, gave a speech. Everybody was real happy. They were all thrilled and energized. One of the people who spoke at this meeting was a guy named William Still. He put it that after Christiana, slaveholders were taught the wholesome lesson that the fugitive slave law was no guarantee against red hot shot.
All right.
So basically, they celebrated it and were very open that they were celebrating the violence of it. They're like, this is what you get. You come trying to, if you try to take people back into slavery, you're going to get fucking killed.
Right. So the political climate was continuing to heat up, leading up to World War II. Basically.
Yes, and this was like a celebratory.
I said
moment
World War II.
Yes,
I meant the Civil War.
Yes, Civil War I.
Eventually, it would lead up to World War II. Right?
So Castor Hanway later, after all this had settled down, joined a progressive Quaker meeting house, the Progressive Friends of Longwood. It was an association of abolitionist Quakers who admitted some non-Quakers becoming what the prosecution accused him of being. So he never gave any public speech or never explained his beliefs or why he was there at Christiana or how he felt about any of this.
Okay.
So the fact that he got involved in this progressive abolitionist organization afterwards kind of begs the question, did the whole ordeal open his eyes and make him more committed to abolition? He clearly seemed like he was not a fan of slavery going into this. He was, but did this make him turn him into an abolitionist, or was he an abolitionist all along?
Or was it just he was kind of weirdly neutral on the topic, but the Quakers had his back, and he thought they were he's like, these are good people. I want to. Well,
he didn't just join
with these people.
He didn't just join the Quakers. He joined a particularly radical abolitionist sect of Quakers. He joined. That's the things we don't actually even know that he was a Quaker. like he didn't, because they admitted some non-Quakers to this abolitionist organization.
They were more about the abolitionist.
Yeah, it was
thing
like
than the Quaker
it was like
thing.
an abolitionist organization that ran out of a Quaker meeting.
Okay.
And so he joined up with them, and so it's possible that like the accusations that the South levied against him of being like a secret Quaker radical abolitionist were true. Like later in his life, that's exactly who he joined up with.
Yeah.
Or it could be that like, you know, he went through this ordeal and was like, yeah, this is fucked up. I am going to get, you know, I am going to get more involved in this. I am going to like try to help, you know, abolish this evil institution. But he stayed out of the news for the rest of his life. He never gave a statement on his beliefs. And so we don't really know. Yeah. Through this whole thing, he never, that's the crazy thing. Like he didn't testify for himself. He didn't speak to the press. He just never said anything to anyone about like why he was at Christiana or how he felt about any of this.
All right.
So, you know, I don't know. Good for him. Like I mentioned, the ultimate whereabouts of Noah Bewley, Nelson Ford, George Hammond, and Joshua Hammond, the four men who had set off all these events when they escaped from Retreat Farm or stole grain from Edward Gorsuch in 1849, is unknown. We don't know what happened to any of them. It is said that they escaped to Canada. That's probably what they did, but that's all.
That's just a supposition.
We don't know. Yeah, there's no more record of them. Eliza was still in Pennsylvania. Remember, immediately after the trial, she didn't flee with William, and she was cleared of all charges and freed. And her former master was notified of her location. So, upon learning that her former master had been made aware of her location, Eliza fled north without her children to avoid capture. In time, William and Eliza Parker's children joined them in Canada. The Parkers, the Pickneys, that was Eliza's family, and their neighbor Abraham Johnson took up residence in a black community, which is now known as North Buxton, Ontario. So it's kind of like a little bit of a weird thing. I think we mentioned in a previous episode, like it's not really known why Eliza was allowed to escape, essentially. Like they did tell her former master that, you know, she was in custody, but they let her out of custody. They didn't like hold her until he could come retrieve her, and they didn't pursue charges.
Did they let her out of custody pretty quickly? Like, did they give him time? Or
No.
They were just kind of like, we got her, and then they let her go?
Yeah, and that was it. So, yeah, it's like one of those weird things. Like it might be like some sort of weird misogyny where like they didn't want to like hold the woman in jail, or they didn't like think that she could escape on her own, or like who knows. But yeah, they let her go, and she was like, fuck this, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And she made her way up to Canada. So yeah, the whole Parker and his friend Abraham Johnson and his brother-in-law, they're the Pickneys, they're all living in North Buxton, Ontario. In A Freeman's Tale, William wrote, Johnson and I each chose a 50-acre lot. I built a house and we moved in that same fall, and in it I live yet. So that was 1866. He didn't live there the rest of his life, but at the time when he wrote The Freeman's Tale, he was still living there.
And where did they get money?
So they got money, presumably just from finding work. Like that was one of the first things that they had to do when they made it into Canada, was to find work.
Okay, yeah. Like when you say you got a 50-acre lot, like
yeah,
somebody paid for that.
Yeah, so
he just saved up for it.
One of the first issues. So there's a few things. So one of the first issues they had in Canada was being able to find work. It took them a few weeks to find work, and it was a struggle for them. This particular part of Canada, this Buxton, Ontario, was kind of still the frontier at the time.
Okay, so they were like more or less given land out if people were willing to work it.
So Buxton basically became a community of escaped slaves. It was like an area on the like western edge of Ontario where they just, they allowed all these escaped slaves from America to establish a community. So, I don't know how much he actually had to pay for that 50-acre lot, but he was able to get some work and pay for it himself. He also did take up a job writing for Frederick Douglass that we'll talk about a little bit. And presumably he also got some aid from abolitionist organizations. So Buxton, I'll say this, was originally known as the Elgin Settlement. It was a region that was settled in 1849 by a Presbyterian minister named William King. Reverend King was an Irishman by birth and had immigrated to America and married into a Louisiana slaveholding family. After the death of his wife, Reverend King inherited a number of her slaves. After doing some missionary work in Canada, King came up with the idea of starting a community of black pioneers and former slaves in Canada. Starting with his own former slaves, the colony grew quickly over the next few years. Within 3 years of its founding, over 130 families had settled in Buxton.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't an accidental community.
No. This was a planned,
founded as a place for former slaves.
Yes.
Well. Okay.
Yes. So Reverend King maintained a place of honor among the residents, and all the day-to-day operations of the community were enacted by the black citizenry. So it was a planned community for escaped slaves and former slaves. And settled in 1849, that was the year that of the escape from Retreat Farm. So by the time William Parker and the Pickneys and Abraham Johnson had made it up there, the community could only have been
a couple years old,
yeah. 2 or 3 years old. So they were probably among the earliest residents of what became known as Buxton. Out of nothing but 9,000 acres of forest in just over 4 years, the residents of Buxton built themselves a school, a church, a store, a hotel, a blacksmith shop, a pearl ash factory, which I'm not sure what that is
either.
It sounds kind of cool. I don't know what it is though. Dozens of homes. They cleared and planted fields of corn, grass, and grain, and eventually boasted over 700 residents. So it went well for them. During their time in the Elgin settlement, William began taking classes at a local school, and that's presumably where he learned to read and write. And now that he knew how to read and write, William would be able to get a job with Frederick Douglass's newspaper called the North Star, and he became their Canadian correspondent.
Oh.
And Parker's fame eventually brought him to the attention, or actually, I don't want to get to that quite yet. So he got this job with Frederick Douglass, writing for Douglass's newspaper. This is how he became known as a writer, and what eventually led to that 1866 Atlantic article, A Freeman's Tale, that
he's just sort of running like a little satellite office of Frederick Douglass's newspaper.
Yep.
Cool.
And kind of getting some attention, because I've quoted him a lot throughout this series, and he was a good writer. He had a good turn of phrase, and so that writing with Douglass's newspaper kind of was what brought attention to him as a writer, and it's the reason that he was able to write A Freeman's Tale, and he was good at it. He also this fame also eventually brought him to the attention of a 38-year-old white abolitionist who was looking for black recruits to take part in a plot against slaveholders. The man wrote a letter on August 27th, 1859, to another member of the plot, detailing having met a man of great interest in Buxton. Writing in code due to the secretive nature of their plot, the recruiter never gave Parker's name, but the description perfectly matches William Parker. The author of this letter was John Brown Jr. Yeah. He was recruiting for his father's upcoming plot to start an armed slave revolt in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Despite Brown's glowing endorsement of Parker and how hard he would work to make him part of, and how hard he wanted to make him part of his father's plan, there's no further evidence that Parker took any part in the event. Perhaps Brown could not come up with the money needed to bring Parker into the fold. But it seems like, had it worked out financially, they probably would have brought Parker down into West Virginia to participate.
He would have loved that.
Well, and, one of the first quotes about Parker was the idea that he was, had he been born in different circumstances, he would have been a general.
Right.
That was what people who knew him said about him. So, presumably they wanted him to be in like a leadership role in this.
Right.
Because the whole thing with Harper's Ferry was they thought that afterwards there was going to be like mass revolts like all across the South.
Yeah.
And they wanted him to essentially be like a general helping run those mass revolts across the South. And anyway, had they been able to pay for it, it's presumably he probably would have gotten involved, but it just didn't work out. Alexander Pinckney, however, did end up fighting on the side of liberty. He traveled south and enlisted in March of 1863 and joined the famous colored regiments, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. That's the one from Glory.
Right.
He was eventually promoted from private to sergeant. Pickney was one of the soldiers who took place in the Battle of Fort Wagner, which is from the 1890 film Glory, as I mentioned. Pickney survived the unsuccessful charge on Fort Wagner, and when the fort was finally abandoned by Confederates in September of 1863, Pickney was assigned as one of the permanent boatmen who ferried men between the fort and the mainland. Pickney was discharged from service in August of 1865 and subsequently moved with his wife Hannah to Michigan, where they disappear from the historical record. So, Pickney, like I said, that was Eliza's brother. That was Parker's brother-in-law, and so he fought in the famous Battle of Fort Wagner and ended up retiring, presumably happily, to Michigan, and disappeared from the historical record. Abraham Johnson, the man who vowed that I would fight till I die when the Gorsuch party surrounded the home, lived out the remainder of his life in the Buxton settlement, living in a plot of land right next to the Parkers. He married, had a family, and his descendants continue to live on his original farm to this day. So
that's cool.
That stayed in the Johnson family. William and Eliza spent many years happily together in Buxton. By 1871, they had 10 children together, 7 of which had been born in Canada. So they had 3 at the time of Christiana that they brought up there with them. As early as 1858, there was interest in publishing William Parker's life story. After the Civil War ended, Parker was assisted by other educated black men to pen the story of his life. Titled A Freedman's Story, Parker's biography was published in 2 parts in February and March 1866 in the Atlantic Magazine. In the summer of 1872, over 20 years after the events that caused him to flee, Parker returned to Christiana for the first time. He visited his old home, which still stood and entertained many of his old friends who still resided in the area. Among those who visited were Peter Woods and Samuel Hopkins, 2 men who had been present at the riot 2 decades before. Parker was a guest of honor at the commencement of Lincoln University, a black, we know because we live around here, but it's the first black university located in Lincoln University, Pennsylvania, and not too far from Christiana. So they had invited him to their graduation ceremony. It was 15 miles south of Christiana. The school had been founded in 1854, due in part to the attention that the Christiana riot had brought to the plight of blacks in Pennsylvania. And it appears that Parker remained in Christiana throughout the summer of 1872 and was present at a meeting of black citizens on August 30th, 1872, regarding the upcoming presidential election. Sometime during Parker's visit to Christiana that year, he became reacquainted with a woman he had known 20 years before named Martha Sims. Martha's husband, Henry Sims, had been one of the men present at the riot and was later imprisoned as one of the 38 indicted for treason. He, like the others, was released and returned home. Henry Sims died not long before Parker's return to Christiana. Apparently, Parker became infatuated with the widow Sims during this visit, and the 2 ran off together. Peter Woods was under the impression that Parker was a widower himself and took Martha Sims back to Canada. However, Eliza was very much alive and caring for the couple's 10 children, who were ranging in age from 1 to 26. William Parker and Martha Sims did not go to Canada, but instead settled in Kenton, Ohio. And according to descendants of Abraham Johnson, when William Parker made this 1872 trip down to the United States, he was never heard from again by Eliza or their children. For the rest of their days, they assumed that William had been the victim of foul play due to his notoriety.
Oh, they never even heard about him?
Nope, that was the end of him.
That sucks.
Yeah. So that's the thing, like, there's always, these are men, these are people. As much as like we want to celebrate William Parker as like a hero of freedom and liberty, and he was a badass, and he did risk his life to save others, and he did a lot of great stuff. He's still a person. He still did some shitty things.
I mean, honestly, there's a correlation. Like, people who are like badass men of action don't think through the consequences of their actions.
Yeah.
They make rash, impulsive decisions all the time. Yep. I feel like it's like a very unusual like figure that you run into in history who was like bold and decisive and like great in a crisis, but was also like, reasonable.
Yeah.
Like they exist, but
yeah.
like they're noteworthy for a reason.
Yep.
Like I feel like, you know, having the kind of temperament that like makes you want to like wade into a gunfight on like, you know, fighting for like the side of righteousness without really giving it too much thought.
Right.
You know, there's some overlap with the kind of personality that like immediately falls in love with like some random woman when you have a wife and 10 kids waiting back home.
Yeah, and so they never saw him again, and he moved to Kenton, Ohio. In Kenton, Ohio, William Parker was a member of the Masonic Order and was known to his neighbors to have been an agent in the Underground Railroad prior to the Civil War. It does not appear that anyone connected him with the famous William Parker and Christiana. So basically, he didn't tell anybody about who he actually was. He just told them, "Oh yeah, I was involved in the Underground Railroad." He didn't specify.
It wasn't like, I'm that William Parker.
Yeah. William Parker and Martha Sims lived as husband and wife for almost 20 years. He died on April 14th, 1891, when he was about 70 years old and was buried in Kenton's Grove Cemetery. Martha Sims Parker died in 1919 and was buried in the same plot. On the stone, it contains the names Martha Sims' daughters and a fate inscription of the name Parker. Eliza lived out the rest of her life in the home they had made in Buxton. She braved the pioneer life in Ontario, persevered, and raised her 10 children alone. Eliza died on May 28th, 1899, and as late as 1969, she was still fondly remembered by her grandchildren. It's kind of cool, like, she just was like, all right, I live here now, and I'm going to, like, raise my kids here, and, like, and she became, like, an important part of the Buxton community. Like, one of the best sources I found on Eliza was this, I just quoted at the beginning, the buxtonmuseum.com. Mm-hmm. It was, she was kind of a pillar of that community, and her 10 kids, you know, became citizens of that community and raised their own families there.
So
and
like she became like a matriarch.
Yeah. So she, you know, Eliza was very much a badass in her own right. And
well, she choked out that duplicitous wagon driver.
Yeah. And she also, like, you know, she kept blowing the horn to call her reinforcements when they were shooting at her. She, you know, made her way to Canada by herself. And and then she lived out her life as like a solo frontierswoman raising 10 kids. Yeah. And became, like a matriarch of her community. Like,
I'm sure she did all right without her husband. I mean, she's a super badass lady.
Yeah.
And also, like, by the time he cleared out, like, her older kids were like in their 20s.
Yeah,
like,
they were
gone. They were, you know, they could help.
Yes.
You know, pitch in as their mom got older and stuff, you know.
So that's the Parkers and the other people from the Parker house. They all, you know, went on to live their lives in Canada, or in Parker's case, Ohio. As for the state of Pennsylvania and the aftermath of the riot on the state and state politics, there was a possible assassination attempt of the sitting governor as a direct result of the riot.
Oh.
So political opponents attacked the Whig Pennsylvania governor, William F. Johnson, as a reckless agitator and soft on blacks and abolitionists. But the state economy was doing well, and Johnson was likely to be reelected in October. Christiana gave them something to attack him with. Johnson had opposed the Compromise of 1850 and refused to support the repeal of the state's 1847 Anti-Kidnapping Act. Johnson's primary concern was that slavery gave the southern states an unfair advantage in the marketplace.
Okay.
He's one of those guys.
Yeah.
He did not advocate for the repeal of the Fugitive Slave Act, as Democrats claimed. He did, however, think it was open to corruption and the fugitive slaves should face jury trial instead of arrest. He felt the law should be obeyed until it was amended. Johnson also opposed amending the state's Anti-Kidnapping Act to allow the state's jails to be used for fugitive slaves. Democrats portrayed Johnson as a friend of the black people and therefore an enemy of working class whites. They claimed that his support of the Anti-Kidnapping Act encouraged violence. It is the voice of command calling upon those who are at home to cut the throats of their master. That's what the Pennsylvania Democratic newspaper said of Johnson. Johnson and the abolitionists were pledged assassins of the Constitution in their insane zeal for the slave. They forget the white. Coincidentally, Johnson had been on a train on the way to a campaign stop in Philadelphia the day of the riot that made a stop close enough to Christiana that some of the rioters got off to check things out after, in the aftermath. Remember, the riot happened early in the morning. So this is like later in the day. His train just happens to be in Christiana, and a bunch of other people were like, hey, let's go check out this riot site. There's no evidence that Johnson got off the train. It's likely that he just stayed on. At the time of the train stop, local officials were in disarray and no clear leadership, and no attempt was yet being made to locate or arrest the rioters. Johnson basically said like, "Oh, I'm the governor. This needs to be handled by local authorities," and just stayed on the train.
Right.
3 days later, he erroneously claimed that those responsible for Gorsuch's death were in jail. 2 days later, when he walked. 3 days later, after this train stop, he erroneously claimed that those responsible for Gorsuch's death were in jail. That was pointed out to him to be false. So 2 days later, he walked back that statement and offered $1,000 reward for their capture. So he was trying to seem like he was, I don't know, tough on abolitionism, I guess, or
tough on black people.
Yeah. But the political damage was done, and Johnson's opponents claimed that his inaction allowed the rioters to escape. Johnson simply didn't act in an attempt to avoid a tough political situation. When that didn't work, he voiced support for the Fugitive Slave Act. Democrats said that Johnson and Pennsylvania's radical abolitionists were responsible for Gorsuch's death, and that Christiana was fuel for the fire of secession. Abolitionists would transform docile slaves into rapists and murderers. Secessionist Southern papers used Johnson as evidence. Compromise could never work. Pro-Union Southern papers blasted him for playing into the secessionists' hands and making the work of Southern moderates much harder. They viewed him as the epitome of Northern irresponsibility. So it's just everybody fucking hates him now. At least everybody in the South hates him. Several days after the riot, Democrats held a meeting at Independence Hall in Philadelphia and passed 12 resolutions, including one that said, "Those who teach blood instruction to others will have the poison chalice returned to their own lips." And in this speech, they made it clear that Governor Johnson was this blood instructor. So people are now calling for his assassination. At least that's how it was reported at the time. That's how people viewed that statement at the time. It is unlikely that this one meeting and resolution led to an attempt on Johnson's life, but it was part of the inflammatory political atmosphere without regard to consequence. A week later, at Mount Carbon in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, an angry group of Democrats attacked Johnson and his campaign with stones and clubs, breaking the jaw of one man. A shot was fired but missed. Democrats claimed that the gun just went off and wasn't aimed at anyone in particular. So that's kind of the assassination. So they create this environment of, anger and violence towards Governor Johnson for not being tough enough on the rioters of Christiana. Uh-huh. And this leads to an attack on his campaign where at the very least one dude had his jaw broken. Yeah. It's not like
somebody may have taken a shot at somebody.
A gun was fired.
Right.
It seems somebody brought a gun there and wasn't being too careful with it. It seems like at the very least they didn't care if Johnson got shot. So Gorsuch's own son, one of Gorsuch's sons, wrote a letter accusing Johnson of being responsible in his father's death that was widely circulated by Democratic newspapers. Whigs accused the Democrats of violating the sanctity of familiar and domestic sorrow for political ends, and Democrats denied the collusion with Gorsuch. The Democratic candidate, William Bigler, was a lumber magnate, portrayed as a backwoodsman and the best shot in Clearfield County as he developed an everyman image. On October 14th, Bigler won by 8,465 votes. Both parties agreed that Christiana was the difference. So going into this, Johnson was like a clear-cut favorite to win re-election. The economy was doing well. He was reasonably well liked. And then Christiana and the way that the Democrats, played Christiana politically ended up getting this guy Bigler elected instead, just a little over a month after the riot. Okay. So it had this the riot was September 11th. October 14th was the election. So it had this like very immediate, very drastic effect on this election, and led to what led to William Bigler being the next governor. Bigler would go on to play a major role in the nomination of James Buchanan for the Democratic presidential ticket. Remember, James Buchanan was from Pennsylvania. He was a political ally of Bigler. So now that Bigler was in the governor's seat, he had more influence on the national convention and was able to push for Buchanan to become president. So in this like weird roundabout way, Christiana helped Buchanan get elected to the presidency.
All right.
Who, he was widely considered one of the worst presidents in history.
Yeah, it's usually in like the bottom 5 when historians make those lists.
Yeah, not a good president.
It's not Pennsylvania's proudest son.
Yep. So as for the rest of Pennsylvania, over time, the black community in Lancaster County grew to remember Christiana as a tragic victory. The event's significance was more complicated for the white community. In the short term, Lancasterians followed the pro-slavery lead of James Buchanan, who had lived in the community and was elected in 1856, as I said. Thaddeus Stevens, the defense lawyer, was an abolitionist politician who represented Lancaster in the U.S. House of Representatives and had assisted in the defense of the accused. He lost his seat to a member of his own Whig party in 1852. Spurned by constituents who would not tolerate his liberal views on racial justice. But after Buchanan's election, Stevens was soon buoyed by a growing anti-slavery sentiment and returned to Congress. So, he took a little bit of a political hit, lost his seat for defending Castor Hanway in this trial, but he was able to get back in it. The Parker House, which was abandoned after the family fled to Canada, became a place of pilgrimage after the Union victory. Curious visitors from around the region sought the abandoned Riot House and took pieces away as souvenirs. By the late 1890s, the farmer who owned the land perceived the Parker House as a dangerous nuisance and knocked it down and plowed it over. In 2008, archaeologists from Millersville University, led by James Dell, did an archaeological dig there, and were joined by black and white descendants of the riot in their excavation, and uncovered part of the foundation wall. So that was the end of that house. The southern reaction is where you really start to get into like
the fomenting.
Yes, because the biggest thing here was the way that it showed that the Compromise of 1850 was dead on arrival.
Right.
And I really think that Southerners already knew that and were kind of just looking for confirmation of what they already felt. On September 14th, 3 days after his death, Edward Gorsuch was laid to rest in a small private cemetery in Baltimore on his Baltimore County property. Dickinson, his son, was not present because he was still recovering in Christiana.
Is he the one that got his head bashed up?
He was the buckshot. He got shot had like 70 buckshot taken out of him or something like that. So he was actually still in Christiana. He wasn't able to even make it back to... Yeah. He was still laid up in Christiana. As a result of his foolish quest, Gorsuch became a martyr to and a cause celeb in the South. Southerners viewed the whole situation as an attack on property rights. To some, Gorsuch was a martyr who died defending the liberties of property. To others, he represented all those guilty of trying to deny the inalienable rights of people based on race. White Southerners had to explain how a superior fighting white men were defeated by slaves, and so they blamed the white abolitionists, and we saw that at the trial.
I mean, I'm not like endorsing the idea of the superior fighting white man.
Yeah.
I mean, there were like 100 black people.
Yes.
Like, it doesn't seem like that needs an explanation, even if you're just accepting the idea that white people are inherently superior. And
well, I think like if you're like a Southern plantation owner and you have 50 slaves working your farm and it's just like you and like 2 overseers, I think you want to believe that
The
like,
three white guys can beat up 50 black guys and it comes down to
because really, like, at any moment they could just end your life.
Yeah.
Like, I think you need to sell yourself that lie. Otherwise you would just live in fear for, being punished for your evil deeds.
They can kill you whenever they want, and they have some very compelling reasons to do so.
I think that you really got to like convince yourself that what you're doing is okay and they're not going to murder you.
Yeah.
Even if you have it coming. So whites, So they began to tell a story where 4 white men and 2 black men were killed, and white abolitionists gave strategic advice. So they just started lying about like what happened at the riot. They're like, yeah, no, we actually killed more of them than they killed of us. But
it's a shame we missed their like general handway.
Governor Lowe of Maryland expressed anger that a citizen of Maryland was murdered, carrying out his legal rights, and his body brutally insulted, and that no one would pay for the Southern honor, and no one would pay. Southern honor was not satisfied. Lowe said this showed that no one can be charged with treason for resisting the Fugitive Slave Act, making the law a mockery and delusion, which is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, yes, this did prove that the Fugitive Slave Act and the Compromise of 1850 would never work, but also to say that because you can't charge someone with treason, the law is a mockery.
Yeah.
Like, that's pretty extreme.
Yeah, there's plenty of other charges you could bring.
Yeah. Be like, no, if you can't charge them with treason, it's worthless. Some months after the trial, a band of Marylanders killed a white man named Joseph Miller and hung his body from a tree. Miller was from Lancaster and was in Baltimore trying to gain the release of a free black woman kidnapped from his farm, a reverse of Gorsuch's mission, and made perfect retribution in the eyes of some Southerners. So, unfortunately,
a symmetry there.
Yeah, that guy tried to do like the reverse Gorsuch. He tried to go
free someone who'd been taken.
Yeah. And so he got lynched for that. Southerners and Democrats thought abolitionists had infected the legal system and that it was actually harder to convict a black man, which is an absurd thing to think. Christiana remained in the Southern consciousness at the time of the Civil War. Noted Civil War historian Charles Blockson said that burning Christiana in retribution was a goal of the Confederate invasion of PA that was halted at Gettysburg. So had the Confederates won at Gettysburg,
that was on their list.
They would have burned Christiana in retribution. Like, that was, we're talking 15 years later at this point. It was still like something that they felt very passionately about. Another like really interesting fallout from Christiana came through Edward Gorsuch's youngest son, Thomas, who resented the fact that his father had been killed and that no killer was brought to justice, and spoke bitterly about it to his classmate, John Wilkes Booth.
Oh.
So in the fall of 1849, John Wilkes Booth began attending Milton Academy in Baltimore County, Maryland. It was a boarding school, which is apparently today an upscale restaurant, and was located 2 miles down the road from the Gorsuch farm. There was many Gorsuch who attended there, and one of Booth's classmates was Thomas Gorsuch, the youngest son of Edward. Though 3 years older than Booth, the two boys developed a friendship, and it's not recorded, but it's not too much of a stretch to imagine that Booth probably visited his friend's family's farm. It's 2 miles down the road. You're at a boarding school, come home for a family supper type thing.
Yeah.
So it's pretty damn likely that John Wilkes Booth knew Edward Gorsuch and spent time on his farm, and then listened to his friend, Thomas Gorsuch, talk bitterly about how there was no justice for a Southern man.
Yeah.
And it probably had some kind of influence on.
Totally. That's like the kind of thing that's like, because you're like young, you're like forming your opinions about the world.
Yeah.
And like you're like, I don't know, man. My buddy, like, he's got like a personal experience, like, all this like woke DEI, like like abolitionist bullshit. Like they've like really screwed his family over.
Yeah.
Like I'm pretty sure this is bad.
And yeah, and I think that's like the important thing is like radicalization is not like a switch. It's like it slowly builds in a person. And like this was absolutely a building block in John Wilkes Booth's radicalization.
Oh, yeah.
It had to be. Booth was still attending Milton Academy in September of 1851 when Ed was killed. While staying with his mother and sister in Philadelphia, 22-year-old John Wilkes Booth, a few years later, witnessed several oratories given by Northerners opposed to secession. Hearing the eloquent speakers motivated Booth to write his own speech to counter the attacks on the South and help others see the injustices the Southern states endured. In the speech, Booth mentions the events at Christiana and those as one of those injustices. The fugitive slave law, gentlemen. When I was a schoolboy, my bosom friend, a boy 3 years my junior named Thomas Gorsuch, he was a noble youth as any living. He had 2 brothers, grown to be men, and an old father who loved and was beloved by them. He was all the man that honor should be. 2 of his Negroes committed a robbery. They were informed on and nearly beat the informer to death. They ran away to Maryland and came to the state of Pennsylvania. The father and his 2 sons and the boy, my playmate, came to the state under the protection of the fugitive slave law, not only to recover their property, but to arrest the thieves that belonged to them. Unfortunately, the rest of that paragraph is lost on the manuscript, so we don't know exactly how he finished it up. But what we do know is that in one of John Wilkes Booth's first public speeches about the Southern cause, he specifically mentioned Christiana. So,
also, big fan of his. I've noticed. Have you noticed that, like, it seems like a long time ago, people were way more effusive in their praise of, like, their childhood friends than anyone ever is. Like, I don't know. I've been friends with you for a long time.
Yeah.
I have a pretty high opinion of you. But if I was, like, mentioning you to someone, I'd be like, oh, yeah, my friend Jeremy. I wouldn't be like, he's the finest man I've ever known.
Yes.
I'd be like, no, he's a good guy. You know? Like,
really over the top.
Yeah.
But yeah, so ultimately, that's kind of it. Like, I think John Wilkes Booth's reaction to Christiana, to me at least, sums up like why Christiana matters. Like I mentioned, the idea that radicalization isn't a sudden change in someone's heart; it's a gradual accumulation of experiences. Like John Wilkes Booth's experiences made him so radically pro-Confederate that he killed the fucking president.
Yeah, and it's like it's like a tipping, like, you know, you start off wherever you start off. Obviously, your like upbringing has like an effect on like whatever your worldview starts out as.
Yeah.
But like once you start to get those, like once you hear your buddy Tommy, who's the finest man you've ever known,
Yes.
you know, talking about, you know, his experience with his dad and, you know, this whole Fugitive Slave Act compromise with the North nonsense. Like, you know, the further you get pushed in that direction, the more you start to filter like new incoming information.
Yeah.
You start to like disregard, like, you know, disconfirming experiences and really latch on to things that like reinforce.
Yeah, and that's absolutely part of it. And I also honestly think a big part of it is that a lot of people already knew what they wanted. And this was just an excuse.
Yeah.
Like they didn't want compromise. They wanted secession. You know, they wanted to kill the president.
Yeah.
You know, they wanted excuses for their radicalization. And, you know, like it said that in that speech that John Wilkes Booth gave, it was a reaction to anti-secessionist speeches. It was, you know, picking excuses or picking things to fortify his argument, to make claims. You know, I think a lot of people at this point were already thinking there's no way this is ever going to work. We want to secede. We want our own country. And hey, this thing just happened. This is a great excuse. This is something we can point to that says that compromise is never going to work, that, you know, secession is the only way. And I think that, like, I was thinking a lot about it. And at first I kind of thought like the compromise of 1850 was never going to work because it still allowed slavery to exist. And you cannot have a compromise that still allows slavery to exist because slavery is fundamentally evil.
Yeah, either everybody has to be cool with it,
Yeah.
or you can't do it. It's not a moral gray area type thing.
But then I started thinking more about it, and I started thinking, like, not that it's necessarily right, maybe having a civil war and ending it quicker is a better way to do it. I would think it probably is, because you need to end slavery as quickly as possible. But I don't think that compromise was impossible.
Yeah.
Like, I think you could have done a gradual abolition plan like they did in Pennsylvania. I think you could have made a political argument in the South that, like, hey, like, we're going to take 30 years and we're going to slowly end slavery over the course of 30 years. And, honestly, like, over that time, they would come to realize, like, oh shit, like, we can just underpay them and treat them like shit, like they do under capitalism now.
Yeah.
And they'd be like, actually, now we don't have to feed and clothe them. This isn't like a bad...
Like, now that's on them.
Yeah. Like, yeah. I think that honestly, like, you could have pulled off a gradual abolition system and kind of showed people that, like, you don't need slavery to exploit labor.
Like, you can even still be a white supremacist.
Yeah. But so, like, ultimately, I kind of think it's better to have a civil war and end slavery, like, end it quicker than drag it out over 30 or 40 years. Because that, the Pennsylvania Gradual Abolition Act took, like, what is it, like 70 years before, like, the last slave was finally freed. Like, it was, the late 1700s that the Gradual Abolition Act was passed, and it was right before the Civil War when the final slave, like, died. So, it would have been well into the 20th century that there would still be slaves in the South if they did a gradual abolition thing. But it could have worked. Like, a compromise would have been possible. And, I think in a way it's actually, it's good that Christiana showed that compromise wasn't possible, even if it is what the secessionists wanted. So that's basically the story. There were some public memorials. There's historical markers at Gorsuch's Tavern and at the Parker House. In 1911, which is the same year that a lynching happened in Coatesville, not too far from Christiana, which is a whole separate story. There was a weird anniversary event for the Christiana riot that was focused on healing the divide that people were feeling, especially between Pennsylvania and Maryland. And they kind of did this whole thing where they focused on Gorsuch as a kind slaver and mostly focused on the white people in the story. A memorial in Christiana presented in 1911 to Edward's granddaughter and Peter Woods, the sole remaining survivor. This was the first memorial erected. This was during my notes are a mess there. In commemoration for the Christiana riot, September 11th, 1851, and the treason trial, September 25th to December 17th, 1851. On one side, the monument states, "Killed Edward Gorsuch. He died for the law," and goes on to list Dickinson and Joshua Gorsuch as being wounded. The other side mentions Castor Hanway's treason trial and that he suffered for freedom. The final side merely lists the name of the 38 men who were indicted. So they did this weird memorial where they tried to, like, both sides it.
Yeah.
But it was like a weird time. This was like the beginning of the Jim Crow laws. Like I said, there was had recently been a lynching in Coatesville. Like, things were not great,
right,
for race relations in Pennsylvania at the time. They did a little bit better in 1851 for the 100th anniversary. Descendants of the local black population posed for a picture with Gorsuch defendants. The story was still kind of retold as, the same kind of both sidesy way to do it.
Gorsuch he was just really believed in the rule of law.
Yeah. But at that time, at that memorial or anniversary in 1851, a black speaker, Dr. Horace Mann Bond, paid tribute to Thaddeus Stevens and William Parker. He wrote, he said, "William Parker is a tragic symbol of our centennial, of the troubles of his generation and of our town. This centennial of violence engendered by the great passions of forces, but also by one man. It is the story of a man without a country. It is the tragedy of William Parker. It is the tragedy of mankind everywhere who would be free, but must resort to violence to obtain their freedom." And then in 2009, the Christiana Historical Society installed a second marker next to the obelisk, which gives special attention to William Parker as more than just a name on the list. It's really just kind of a recent thing that people have stopped trying to kind of both sides Christiana. Like, you know, it's not hard doing research like for this. It's not hard to go back and find, you know, articles and stuff that kind of do the like, oh, it's like the John Brown, like, terrorist or freedom fighter type thing where they're like, oh, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Like, murder is never acceptable. You know, he was well within his legal rights, blah, blah, blah. And it wasn't until, you know, the 21st century that people really started talking about it as like, no, you know, sometimes you have to kill somebody to maintain your freedom or to get others to freedom. But yeah, that's the Christiana riot. And, yeah, like I said, I think I think the best way for me to look at it is as a building block towards radicalization, as a building block to the Civil War. Right. You know, there's not one event that leads to something like a Civil War. There's all these little things that build up and build up and build up until, you know, eventually it explodes. And I think this was definitely, you know, seeing the effect it had on John Wilkes Booth, seeing the effect that it had on the South in general, the fact that they still wanted to burn Christiana during the Gettysburg campaign.
Years later, yeah.
You know, it had an impact, and it definitely led towards the expansion of secessionist attitudes in the South. And that's the Christiana riot.
All right. Good story.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. I obviously live right here and have an interest in history, so I know about the Christiana riot, but it's a lot of stuff that I didn't know.
Yeah.
A lot of neat stuff.
Cool. Well,
I didn't know about the John Wilkes Booth connection at all.
No, that's a fun one.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for joining me on the podcast, Andy, and thanks you to anybody who's listening, and goodbye.